We're visiting with Mr. J.B. Williams. He is a columnist and investigative reporter. You can read his columns at CanadaFreePress.com. That's CanadaFreePress.com. Now, we were talking about the Fort Hood terrorist attack, and I wanted to kind of shift gears a little bit. You have been working on a special project, and I know you wanted to tell our listeners about it.
I do. It's operating under Freedom Force USA or USA Freedom Force. The website for it is www.freedomforce.us, as in United States. And what had happened is I had written a column about 3 weeks ago now, suggesting that the Tea Parties needed to become tangible before they lost all of their momentum. The people woke up. They took note of what was going on in their country. They gathered together. They organized, and they protested, and nobody listened. So they protested again and again and again, and still nobody listened. At this point, the Tea Party, the 9/12, the town hall process out there across the country has to find a way to become tangible, and I wrote a column about that. Well, the column led to Part 2, Part 3, Part 4, and by the third or fourth part, we had formed Freedom Force. And what we had found out was a couple important factors. One, there's more than 2,000 factions of the Tea Party, 9/12, and town hall movements out there across the country with 2,000 different leadership groups in 2,000 different directions. And the reason that the press and the government continue to laughingly mock those movements is because they're all fractured, and they appear to be little, small, insignificant fringe groups. That's because they're divided. If they were united, they wouldn't be taken that way by the press or by the government, because they are millions and millions of average citizens. And so Freedom Force came about, as they say, necessity is the mother of invention, because we were looking for a way to not organizationally unite all of these different groups, because most of them are doing grassroots things that need to continue to go on out there across the country. But we're looking for a way to unite them in a single purpose nationally while those things were going on locally, continuing to go on. Raise funds, make it a formidable force. People have asked what we mean by that. I can sum it up by simply saying the Patriot movement as a whole needs to become a very powerful, viable lobby force in Washington, D.C. as quickly as possible if they want to have any say at all about what happens in this country.
The number one thing is, first of all, let's define these folks that you're wanting to join. It's not really, are you asking them to join an organization per se, or are you asking them or trying to impress upon these folks that, you know, it's important to be organized? Because things I've seen over the years is organization is always the key, because we're spread out all over the place. Yeah, there's tons and tons of people of like mind and of similar values, but getting everybody together, much less on the same page and organized, you can pretty much forget it.
Well, you're exactly right. It's not so much join an organization as much as it is support a movement, and a strategy, a particular strategy, if you will. And I'll talk about a couple others. 9/12 group, they have their own thing going on. The Precinct Chair Initiative has their own thing going on at this point. The State Sovereignty and States' Rights Initiative is going on, and it has its own agenda. And those are all important things, and they need to continue at the grassroots level, because those are the things that are the long-term answer. However, it's my opinion, and the opinion of the people who are involved with trying to organize this Freedom Force, that unless we do something soon at a national level to get, excuse me, to a position where we can be heard by the GOP in particular first, and then in Washington, D.C. on a larger scale, unless we do something nationally, it would take a generation or two to affect the kind of changes that we need to affect in this country by grassroots efforts alone. Long-term, grassroots level involvement has to happen, and it needs, all those initiatives need to continue. But in the meantime, if that's all we're doing, we can change the players, but we can't change the game. And we need a game changer right now. We need to be able to stop things like cap and trade. We need to be able to stop things like socialized medicine. We need to be able to stop things like amnesty for illegals, all of which is coming down the pike whether we want it or not. 90% of the people can poll against it, and it's still coming. We need a game changer. So Freedom Force is trying to develop a nationwide network of all these different people and all these different groups who support one strategy, and that is to become a viable lobby force in Washington, D.C. immediately so that we can begin to immediately affect some changes up there.
All right, I want to get into some more detail of this. I want to find out who is the atypical, prototypical Freedom Force member. How do you, what kind of game-changing things are you talking about? And specifically, how do you become that force in Washington, D.C. as quickly as possible? We're going to talk about those things and more when we get back from the break. We're visiting with J.B. Williams. Welcome back into the Matthew Hill Show. Matthew Hill with you today. We're visiting with J.B. Williams, and J.B. is a columnist. You can read his writings at CanadaFreePress.com, amongst other places. That's CanadaFreePress.com. Now, J.B., I'm sorry to have to cut you off there before the break, but we had a hard break there at the bottom of the hour, and you were talking about this brand-new initiative that kind of came out of a series of columns you wrote about a month or so ago, and it's called Freedom Force. In fact, you've even got a website now, freedomforce.us. That's freedomforce.us. And what you basically said as we were going to break, if I understood correctly, is that Freedom Force, it is your intention for Freedom Force to be a kind of a networking tool so that people who love freedom, everybody from the people who are expressing their concerns at town halls, people who don't want to see our country go down the socialistic path to what I think is destruction, the state rights people, the 9/12 people, those kinds of folks, that they would not abandon their individual organizations, but they would use Freedom Force as kind of the hub of the wheel for the specific purpose of lobbying leaders in Washington, D.C. Is that correct?
I think that's a great way of putting it right there.
All right. Now, I want you to describe for me, there's people listening to my show right now, and they're either thinking, A, JB is a kook, or B, I really want to be part of this Freedom Force. Who is the type of person that wants to be part of the Freedom Force?
Well, the feedback that we've gotten so far, we launched the site that you just mentioned about 2 weeks ago, a little over 2 weeks ago. It's only a pledge site right now. We're not accepting any donations right this minute. We set a pledge goal of $10 million and a time frame in which to try to raise it, and as a starting point, because what we're describing would cost some money to do. It costs money to get a seat at the table in Washington, D.C. right now. And I realize how offensive that is to people, including myself, but that's the rules of the game. If you want to change the rules of the game, you got to control the game first. Can't just sit around and complain about it. So the typical Freedom Force supporter right at the moment is very much the average, common, everyday American Joe who is fed up with watching Washington, D.C. ignore the states' rights, ignore the people's rights, ignore the polls, ignore the protests, and continue to function in a way that is completely at odds with the constitutional powers afforded the federal government, and they're looking for a peaceful way to resolve this before we run out of peaceful options. There are a lot of people in this country, and I believe a majority of them, who simply do not agree with or believe in what's going on in Washington, D.C. today. I saw a poll the other day from Rasmussen where Barack Obama's strong support is all the way down to 27, 28% at this point. Only Democrats in Congress have a lower rating. And it's because they have decided that since they won the last two election cycles and have control of both houses of Congress and the White House, that now is the time to run roughshod over the rest of the country. And the rest of the country, of course, has decided that that's not exactly what they had in mind when they voted for change. And so, at this point, what Freedom Force is saying is very simply, the way you described it is very good, but I would go one step further and say, there has to be some immediate changes in order to get even to a 2010.